Midnight settles over Moscow like a heavy coat, and a lone clerk's lamp cuts a hard circle of light. A diplomat leans into the keys of a metal typewriter, each strike a quiet verdict on a new era. Who is he, and why does his message matter? George F. Kennan, a seasoned American observer in the Soviet capital, drafts a cable on February 22, 1946 that will redefine strategy. What problem is he trying to solve? The victory glow of 1945 is fading, replaced by suspicion as Moscow tightens control at home and probes for leverage abroad. What is the core of Kennan's diagnosis? He argues the Soviet leadership blends ideological mission with chronic insecurity, needing an external adversary to justify internal mobilization. How does that translate into behavior? Test the margins, apply pressure, avoid honest compromise, and retreat only when met by firm and credible resistance. Why does this land so sharply in 1946? Signals accumulate that do not match the wartime coalition's image, from troop delays in Iran to heavy-handed politics across Eastern Europe. Where do we see those signals on the map? In the Straits crisis that worries Turkey, in rigged coalitions hardening into one-party states, and in propaganda that frames openness as a threat. What gives the diagnosis a public echo? On the 5th of March, 1946, Winston Churchill speaks in Fulton about an iron curtain, and Kennan's cable provides the analytic scaffolding behind the phrase. What action does Kennan propose instead of rage or panic? A long, patient, but unyielding containment that limits the reach of Soviet power until internal contradictions hem it in. Is the goal regime change or something else? He is explicit. Protect vital interests, shape the environment, and wait for time, performance, and contrast to do their work. Why does style matter as much as content? Because Kennan writes not a memo of the moment, but a theory of Soviet conduct with operational consequences for diplomats, financiers, and soldiers. How does Washington absorb this? Debate sharpens in the State Department, then breaks into policy as crises force choices that embody containment in practice. What is the first major articulation of that choice? In March 1947, President Truman pledges aid to Greece and Turkey, signaling that threatened regions will not be left to coercion. How does economics become a strategic weapon? In June 1947, the European Recovery Program ties prosperity to stability, binding free states together through markets, standards, and credit. Why does Kennan write again in 1947 under the letter X? To present the intellectual spine of containment to a wider policy audience, stressing vigilance, confidence at home, and steady pressure abroad. Was containment conceived as primarily military? No. Kennan frames it first as political, economic, and psychological, a competition of endurance, cohesion, and example. What events begin to tilt the balance toward harder power? The Berlin blockade of 1948 forces an air bridge of stamina and planning, proving resolve without firing a shot. What institutions lock in common defense? In April 1949, NATO is signed, transforming shared risk into a credible shield and making aggression calculable and costly. How does 1949 change the strategic equation again? The first Soviet atomic test ends the American monopoly and intensifies the search for doctrines that deter without spiraling into war. What prescription arrives in 1950? NSC 68 calls for rearmament, larger budgets, and global presence, shifting containment's center of gravity toward military preparedness. Where is the first brutal test of limits? Korea in 1950, where the United States fights a limited war to restore a line rather than crusade to remake an entire peninsula. Would Kennan have applauded every step? Not entirely, for he warns repeatedly against turning containment into a universal military reflex divorced from prudence. What kind of strength does he prize most? Institutional credibility, productive capacity, and the magnetic pull of open societies that makes closed systems appear brittle. Why is this more than 1940s history? Because great power rivalry today still hinges on rules, choke points, supply chains, and information domains rather than on occupation alone. What does patient containment mean in the 21st century? Resilience against disinformation, defense of critical infrastructure, secure technology bases, and alliances that can hold under stress. How does the Berlin airlift illuminate the method, hold the line, escalate only in carefully chosen ways, and let competence, logistics, and public confidence create a moral high ground? What did the Marshall Plan change beneath the headlines? It rewired European economies, accelerated productivity, and made integration a security asset rather than a technocratic dream. Where does containment reveal its tragic edges? In uprisings from Budapest to Prague, where hopes outrun what can be risked without igniting a global war. What is the lesson of those limits? Containment promises time and space, not instant liberation, and sometimes stability outruns aspiration in the arithmetic of risk. How does the adversary adapt? With counter-alliances, heavy militarization, and finally walls, whose concrete betrays the fear Kennan mapped in theory. Why does Kennan keep returning to the power of example? Because closed systems fear comparison, and the visible success of free institutions is a solvent that works slowly but surely. What are the costs of forgetting that in the global South? Short-term bets on stability sometimes back regimes that stain credibility and breed durable skepticism toward Western motives. How do systems actually fail in the end? Less by shattering than by eroding through output gaps, technological lag, and reform paralysis that compound year after year. What makes this directly relevant now? Decisive contests unfold in chip fabs, energy networks, logistics software, and standards bodies where leverage is quiet but real. What can smaller states teach large coalitions? That diversified energy, protected ports, and media literacy increase the strategic slack of the whole alliance without grand speeches. How was Kennan's voice different from the drumbeat of his time? Cool, exact, and focused on what policy could actually do, turning diagnosis into programs and abstractions into budgets. Why did he distrust the militarization of every problem? Because war corrodes the moral ledger, drains legitimacy, and distracts from the slow, compounding returns of competence. So what is patience in strategic terms? The art of choosing tempo and terrain, forcing rivals into a marathon where innovation, alliances, and governance decide the finish. What do the keystrokes of February 1946 still say? Think before the noise, write with a compass, not a slogan, and let clarity become policy rather than posture. How is containment applied without bright front lines? Through defensive architectures for technology, rules for capital and data, and credible signals that collective defense is not rhetorical. Why do words like patience, firmness, and vigilance endure? Because they impose structure on cost, reassure friends, and make opponents calculate instead of gamble. What remains of Kennan the man? A scholar in government, later a gardener of ideas in Princeton, a persistent critic of overreach and complacency alike. What is the essential method that outlives its author? Look for causes, not just symptoms. Explain them without hysteria, and match means to ends with discipline. How should a non-linear age read the long telegram? As a manual for endurance that channels pressure, avoids overextension, and prizes narrative credibility as much as hardware. Where does the story end? Not in fanfare, but in the quiet echo of syllabi, strategy papers, and institutions that learned to pace themselves across decades. What remains when the snow of that Moscow winter is gone and the archives breathe softly? Power lasts when it is justified, order lives by example and proportion, and time rewards those who can hold their line without losing their nerve. If clarity and patience made a strategy in 1946, what keeps them from slipping today? Only whether we can resist the impulse to trade long-term leverage for short-lived noise and whether we still believe that restraint can be a form of strength.